So today I'm going to be talking about gender nonconformity, which is very prevalent in the autism community. So to get started, I will say that there's quite a bit of research that shows that autistic people are a lot more likely to be either trans or part of the LGBT community. They're also more likely to be non-binary, and they're likely to have diverging feelings about their gender identity. And so there's a couple reasons for this. So from a neuroscience perspective, in a female autistic brain, the orbital frontal cortex actually more closely resembles a neurotypical male. I thought that this area of research was really fascinating. And likewise, for an autistic male, their orbital frontal cortex resembles more similar to neurotypical females. There's a lot of other patterns as well that align like this. So autism doesn't make people more masculine. The TLDR of it is that autism will make men a little bit more feminine and women a little bit more masculine. So kind of like a overall androgynous balancing act. And I think there's a couple reasons for this. I think the first reason is that one thing that autistic people, like myself, really struggle with a lot is understanding gender roles and gender norms. Even after understanding it, whether we're explicitly told, this is how society perceives ladies, this is how society perceives men. Even if we're explicitly told all of these things, we're more likely than neurotypical people to challenge these ideas, because fundamentally we can see through it. Basically, the way that I see it, gender expectations and gender norms are all kind of pointless from my perspective. So I think it's really restricting the way that people function. And I'll explain what I mean here. So back in the 1800s, it was totally normal for men to wear dresses. In fact, it was expected in a lot of ways. But then at some point this shifted, and then wearing dresses became a thing that only women were allowed to do. I think that these categories, this categorization is really harmful to our society. It restricts the natural flow of who we are by telling people how they should behave, and telling people that if they behave outside of this binary, that they're somehow less than in their gender. So if you have a woman who's super interested in cars and engineering and super analytical, she's just kind of dismissed as a tomboy. Or worse, people think that there's some gender anomaly when there isn't. And they don't really respect women enough to leave it up to us in a lot of cases. Now, I know everyone's experiences are different, so everything I say in all of my podcasts, I highly advise you to understand that this is just one perspective. Everyone who has autism experiences it differently, and I am but one perspective of literally hundreds of thousands of people, probably, hopefully, more than that. So please keep that in mind when you're listening. But I think that these gender expectations are really harmful. Why is it that ladies are expected to know exactly how to socialize basically from birth? If there's a girl who doesn't know how to socialize, something must be wrong. Society really frowns upon that. Girls aren't really allowed to or expected to be introverted in their own ways, or just enjoy being alone. If there's a girl who doesn't want to talk to other people at age 3, 4, 5, whatever, everyone suddenly panics. It's almost like introversion is demonized in our society. But even more than that, if you have a quiet boy, a young boy who just wants to do his own thing and not really pay attention to other people, that's totally fine. Because, let boys be boys, that saying. It's just stupid. There's so many of these gender roles and expectations which are actually super harmful to everyone. It's not just harmful to women, it's harmful to women and men. And everyone in between, too. If you, what's the problem with a guy wearing a dress? Why is that so threatening? For a lot of people, is their masculinity hanging on such a thin thread that you're gonna get threatened by a man wearing a dress? Like, it doesn't make any sense. And to make things worse, in particular with autism, this is a huge problem. I believe this is why so many women and girls go undiagnosed for so long. Because from birth, we're expected to be great at socializing. And so that means subconsciously we learn how to mask. I started masking from the age of like 2 or 3, maybe 3. I started masking at age 3, which literally meant I was copying the facial expressions of everyone that I was around. And this is not the same thing as babies and toddlers just learning basic social expression. No, I was blindly copying it without really knowing what it meant. All the way down to not just smiles, but frowns, surprised faces. I copied my sister, my mom, my dad, my grandparents. I copied so much. And it's kind of sad now. Like, when I look back at some of my old pictures, I kind of feel like all of this masking that I was doing subconsciously because it was so expected, it's almost like, what would I have looked like in that moment without the mask? What expression would I have made if I had known what these expressions meant, and if I had neurotypical parts of the brain that control social understanding? And it's just kind of a weird feeling to see that. I look back in time at some of these pictures and I'm kind of uncomfortable around it because I see myself copying everyone else. And it's sad that I had to do that. And I'm conscious of it now, so I'm trying to not do that anymore. It's still difficult though. So here's the thing. When I speak, my voice is naturally pretty flat, as you can probably hear. Not like vocal fry flat, but just regular flat. But for some weird reason, when you talk in a flat voice, society thinks that you must have malice. That a flat voice somehow means you're completely uninterested in whatever you're talking about. And that couldn't be further from the truth for most autistic people. We talk in a flatter voice because the parts of the brain that control vocal expression, facial expression, and intonation are fundamentally very different from neurotypical people. It's completely different. And so it's a frustrating experience to be more or less constantly judged in accordance with these facial expressions, vocal intonations, and everything else. I can't tell you how many times I've said something completely genuine and people ask me if I'm being sarcastic or if I'm joking or whatever. I'll say something that I believe and something really kind too, and people just don't seem to know that I'm being serious. And then when I clarify that, they seem flabbergasted. And so, even more than that, masking for me entailed from an early age changing the tone of my voice in order to be perceived as friendly and warm and kind. The only way that I could get the outer world to understand the kind of person I am inside was by masking my tone of voice. Which was it's really kind of sad if you think about it. Like, the way that I'm talking right now, if you met me in real life, I wouldn't be talking like this at all. I really wouldn't. Unless I knew you were also autistic or ADHD or whatever. But, like, suppose I'm going into a work meeting. I'll give you a perfect example of what that sounds like. Oh, hi, how are you? It's so good to see you. It's been a while, hasn't it? It's pretty hot outside today, isn't it? Do you hear the difference? Like, it's like having a customer service voice, except you cannot ever take it off. Like, you have no choice but to interact in your customer service voice with every person you meet. Because otherwise, they're not going to understand. People don't understand that talking in a flat voice does not mean that you're not interested. They just don't get it. And so there is this extreme mismatch between vocal intonation and facial expression between autistic people and neurotypicals, and this causes a huge problem. And so then how this ties into gender is that I don't think that autism presents differently in women than men. In fact, I think it presents however it's going to present in that particular individual. But women are expected from an early age to know everything about these social concepts, uphold them, and we're expected to do more. We're constantly expected to do more than men are. And that's the truth of it. And then frequently the men get the credit for it. And I think part of this is an underlying misogyny in our society, but I think that there's a lot to be said here. It's not that men have autism more frequently than women. It's that women have to mask so hard subconsciously just so that we're not bullied into submission, just to exist. Just to exist, we have to change almost everything about ourselves just for people to understand our internal state. Like, in the slightest. I'll give you another perfect example. I was at work the other day, and my coworker came up to me, and he's like, "What's wrong?" And I was just like, "What? Like, what do you even mean? Like, what's wrong?" He thought that I was angry or upset because I had a flat expression on my face. But this is the expression, for me, that is natural when I'm concentrating. I was concentrating on a task, trying to figure it out. And see, this is exactly what I mean. There's such a huge mismatch between the way that my face experiences emotions compared to other people. So that when other people see it, they don't understand, they don't have the right perceptions. And I think part of this is a bunch of ignorance in terms of what autism looks like. So most people think that however they view the world, that everyone else has those same inputs. I know this, and I'm not excluding myself in this statement either. I thought the same thing for 26 years. I thought that everyone had the same inputs, and that we came to different conclusions, thinking about things in a logical way, and then that's how people had different personalities, because we had different opinions, thought about things differently. I thought there was like a lot more logic happening in the brain, instead of everything just being based on some kind of emotional reaction. Like, yeah, sure, I experience a lot of emotions, and I experience them differently than other people. But I really legitimately thought that everyone went through this logical series of thinking before doing and speaking and acting. And I couldn't really understand why people would overreact sometimes. Like, why they would have such a strong emotional response towards something that didn't even matter. And so then once I realized that I'm actually observing and experiencing life completely differently from everyone else, it also made me realize how emotional humans really are. Most of the time, this logical process doesn't really happen, or if it does, it's kind of subdued. And we think it's a logical process, but actually, it's a collection of our beliefs combined with past experiences, which creates an inherently biased view of the world. Now, this bias is not something that anyone can actually get away from, but it's important to recognize that it is there and that it exists, so that you can challenge it. So if you have an immediate thought about something, you are emotionally mature enough to take a step back and say, is that really the judgment I want to make? Is that really what I want to say? Is that really how I want to act? Having that extra layer of self-awareness in what you're saying and what you're thinking and what you're doing is not always easy either. It's something that can be really difficult, especially in our society where men are more or less seen as superior. It's sad that I am mentioning this and that I'm saying this, but it's true. If you look at when a man does something, he gets celebrated for doing it. When a woman does the exact same thing, celebrated so much less. Like, look at sports, for example. Men make significantly more money from the same exact sports than women. Why is that? Part of it is that people care more about men's sports than women's sports. But I think that this says a lot about this internalized misogyny in our society. And this is something that I'd like to raise a lot of awareness about. That it's not only being autistic that's really impacted my life, but being autistic and a lady. If I was born a man, I probably would have had so many less issues than I have, or at least had, I guess I should say, because I'm at a point in my life where things are really stable and going great for me. But that was not always the case. I was bullied so harshly in elementary school, middle school, partially in high school. for so many reasons, for everything under the sun, really, just for being different. People see someone who's different from them and they automatically fear them. But then somehow, if you're a woman who's loud and confident and analytical and intelligent, sometimes people get intimidated by that. They see you as threatening. But if you take a man who's the same exact way and instead everyone applauds him and says, oh, he's confident and he's smart, he's great, there's just such a huge double standard between men and women in the way that they're supposed to act and respond. Like, it completely boggles my mind that we all have faces. We all have faces that we're judged on almost instantly when people meet us. We all have faces, and we all have genders, and we all have these categories, so many categories that are assigned to us from birth. And these categories somehow explain the expectations that we're supposed to adhere to without anyone ever actually explaining what those expectations are. I mean, I got lucky. I had a family that was willing to explain a lot to me. Honestly, like, I've had probably more explained to me than the average autistic person. Both because I had a supportive family who was willing to do that, and because everyone in my family really wanted me to succeed and saw the potential that I had and nurtured it from birth, pretty much. I am very privileged and blessed in so many conceivable ways. It still is amazing to me. So I'd like to mention that because I think that sometimes conversations like this can go down really dark holes, and it's important to recognize the things that you do have and the advantages that you do have, because not everyone has that. But there's such a huge mismatch between the way that I describe things and the way that other people understand things. For example, if I say something like, the grass is green, there's a lawnmower. Maybe this isn't the best example, but having two statements. When I hear the grass is green, there is a lawnmower, together, I don't make any connections between them. But neurotypical people frequently do. So when autistic people hear two statements, we treat them as isolated, separate statements. When neurotypical people hear two statements, they treat them as connected statements. I don't think that one way of doing this is superior from the other. I think that there are different ways of thinking that both are valid and both are useful in certain circumstances. But this causes huge problems because if you're autistic or a person that speaks literally and you grow up thinking that other people are going to take your words at face value, they just don't. Like, so many times they don't. You say something and people think that it's linked to whatever else you said before. One typical thing that I see, if you say, I like this, I like that, and maybe there's three things, then neurotypical people will assume that because you didn't say I like that third thing, that means you don't like that third thing. Like, a lot of people think that if you like one thing and you say that you like that one thing, that it automatically means that you don't like the other thing. This is like a link that a lot of people make in language. There's so many language links if you really start thinking about it and studying it. People link together so many different things in language. Like if I say, I'm hungry, and then I say, I like sandwiches. For someone who's autistic, these are two separate statements. That just because I say I like sandwiches and that I say I'm hungry does not necessarily mean that I want to eat a sandwich right now. But for someone who's neurotypical, that linkage between the two statements, I'm hungry and I like sandwiches, is almost instantaneous. It happens so quickly. It's probably subconscious. They probably don't even realize they're doing it. But these two links, the way that people, neurotypical people, listen to and perceive language as is inherently linked. I would even venture to say that near 0% of communication is actually taken at face value from neurotypical people. Which is really unfortunate, because I speak with the only framework that I have. This is why I talk so much. This is why I was so talkative as a child. Because I was desperately trying to get the truth of what I'm experiencing the truth of the message, the truth of everything, all of this information. That's why I give so many details, because I was obsessed with giving the full truth, and I felt like nothing else will do. Because when I tried to give less information, and this happened so often, whenever I try to give less information, people make assumptions, and those assumptions are either not correct, not what I was intending, and I don't think it's fair to place all this on autistic people either. In communication is a two-way street. People have to meet halfway, and if they're not willing to do that, then I'm simply not going to interact with it anymore. I don't think that the burden of communication lies on autistic people, or other neurodivergent people, or any one person. I think that when you're communicating, it's really important to, first off, understand the framework for the way the other person understands and receives information, and second of all, do your best to speak in a way that they will understand. But I think it's also important to note that it's not okay to gaslight people. It's not okay to say, you should have done this, you should have been better at communicating, you should have said it like this. That one really grinds my gears. Like, it's so easy to just communicate in a kind and non-violent way. You talk about your observations, you talk about your feelings, you talk about your underlying needs. You listen to the other person's feelings, you listen to their underlying needs, and then you can find a solution where everyone's needs are met. Rather than playing the victim and saying, you should have said it like this, or you should have said it like this, or you know what I mean. No, I don't actually know what you mean. I don't know what you mean. I'm autistic. I see the world differently. I have a different brain wiring, and this means that whatever you say, I'm going to take your words at face value. I literally had a manager before who told me in detail what he wanted me to do, and because of a typo, I ended up wasting 6 hours of my day trying to implement a solution of this one thing, and he blamed me for it, basically. He said, it's your fault because I said this one thing, and then you did this one thing, but you should have known that I meant this other thing. Like, it is not that hard to just say what you mean. It's really not. If you need more words to do it, do it. But you don't get to gaslight and blame other people for the way that you're communicating with them. And it's really important to try to do your best to understand that people communicate in different ways. And just because their style of communication is different from yours does not inherently make yours superior. I think that this plays a huge role in nonverbal people as well. I've seen a lot of autistic nonverbal kids, and every time I meet these kids, I just am blown away. I feel like almost brought to tears just knowing that they have so much in them, so much intelligence, so much potential. Sometimes these people are the smartest people you'll ever meet in your life. There's this one autistic kid that I see pretty frequently, and he's almost completely nonverbal. He's like 4 years old, and I can tell you every time I see this kid, I just have this extreme feeling that he's going to be a genius. Maybe he already is a genius. He has so much potential in him, and I think it's really sad that people who are nonverbal are more or less seen as subhuman in our society. Just because someone can't articulate their experiences does not make them any less valid. It doesn't make them dumb. It doesn't make them retarded. It's a word I really hate. I hate that word with a passion. And it doesn't make them inferior to anyone else. Having a different communication style or a different method of communication does not make anyone superior or inferior. We're all people. We're all trying to live on this planet together. We all have similar needs, similar underlying experiences, some similar needs, and similar feelings too, even if some of us process those feelings differently. And I think it's really important to acknowledge this, to acknowledge that there is no one superior correct way to live, and to acknowledge that these biases exist and are super harmful to everyone. I can absolutely envision a world where people are aware of their biases, are willing to correct them, are willing to consider new information, and are willing to dismantle the underlying structures that hold them in place. In particular, I've noticed a lot of really positive momentum in recent years, and maybe in the last decade or so, with trans people getting more representation and non-binary becoming more accepted and gender spectrum as a whole becoming more accepted. Because ultimately, there's so many neuroscientific reasons that people might identify as trans or might identify as gender fluid. Like, it's all neuroscience anyways. And there's so much information that is publicly available. It's so easy to educate yourself on this topic. You can just do a basic Google search. It's really easy, and it's frustrating when people don't do that sometimes. But I think that as our generation starts leading the world, and that as younger generations come into this world, that we're going to slowly change the world one day at a time. I think that the younger generations are a lot more open-minded with this sort of thing, because they realize that vulnerability is simply a part of what it means to be human, and that being one race, one gender, being a certain characteristic doesn't make you superior to anyone else. I seriously dream of the day when men and women can get the same opportunities, make the same amount of money for, the same skills. And for people outside of this gender binary to be publicly accepted instead of sometimes accepted only when it is convenient for my political agenda, or I'm going to pretend like I accept you when really I don't, type of deal. I see a lot of this. A lot of people pretend to be allies and then they actually aren't. And that's also harmful for reasons that I'm sure you already know. I would love to just see people be willing to express themselves authentically without caring what society thinks of that. Whether that means how you're behaving, how you're talking, the way that you're making eye contact, how you're communicating, how you're expressing your gender, I don't care. I want people to be their authentic selves without fear. I think that if people could get past this idea of judgment, of being afraid of being judged, that they would be able to be who they actually are, instead of having to make a fake persona online to cater to a very specific perception to get more likes, or to become an influencer, or to get more followers, or whatever. You can just be who you are. Like, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with being an influencer or getting followers, but if you have to change the very fabric of who you are in order to do that, forget that. Don't do that. You start with your authentic self, and the right people who resonate with it will enter into and stay in your life experience. By holding that space to be yourself authentically, you also, by default, will hold this space open for others. When you make the decision to express yourself authentically, whatever that means for you, whether that's gender, communication, the way that you listen to people, the way that you understand people, the way that you dress, whatever it is, that is a level of authentic vulnerability and confidence that I will always embody, and I will never stop hoping and wishing and expecting others to do the same. And that right there is one of the greatest strengths that autistic people have. We see through the bullshit. We see through it completely, and we know that it is never worth changing yourself to appease other people or to try to fit into a social norm. We inherently and instinctively know that it is not right to try to force yourself to be someone that you are not.